My story is called Silence Strums My Ears. The only one of my great-grandmothers who was still alive by the time I was born was Louise Ordway Baldwin. She had one eye and an abrasive personality. Since we lived in China and she lived in Maryland, we didn't see her very often. My clearest memory about Gammy is my mother telling me she was dead when I was 5. She was the first person I ever knew who died. And I understood that my mom was hurting and that I'd never see Gammy again, but not much else. I eventually learned that she was the first woman in Maryland to own and drive her own car, and that this freedom had meant so much to her that she had continued to drive into her late 90s, when she had shrunk down so small that she needed to sit on a pile of telephone books to reach the steering wheel. Apparently, towards the end of her life, the town had a local policeman follow her whenever she drove, so that he could pick her up and prop her back in place when she occasionally, accidentally opened the car door and fell out. The men in my family tree have had their stories passed down in history books. My father's father was the American representative to Taiwan for a decade, and his brother was the ambassador to Austria during the Cold War and instrumental in bringing down the Berlin Wall. He worked as the deputy director of the UN Political Affairs Office at the US State Department. On the Baldwin side, my mother's side, one male ancestor was the cook on the Lewis and Clark expedition, the first settler exploration of the western portion of America led by Sacagawea, a Lemhi Shoshone First Nations woman who is now the face on the $1 coin in the US. On my father's side, one of my great-greats is the subject of a biography called Thompson Dean, Capitalist, written in 1891. He was one of the most famous steamboat men of the Ohio and Mississippi and delivered supplies to Union soldiers during the Civil War. My father's mother is descended from King Oscar II of Sweden through an illegitimate union with a noblewoman. It was during his rule that Norway became an independent country. His grandmother was Desiree Clary. She was at one time engaged to Napoleon, but eventually married Karl Johan, who went from being the Marshal of France under Napoleon to being King of Sweden and Norway in 1810, when he succeeded the childless King Charles VII of Sweden. I know a lot about the men, but I don't know much about the women. The few stories that dripped down are far between. My mother is a feminist, and so am I, so it isn't out of lack of interest. It's just because people tell men's stories more often than they tell women's. On my father's side, there is Jane Ryan, a poor Irish immigrant from a family of publishers whose printing house burned down in Dublin. She met my wealthy great-grandfather while working at a glove shop in New York. They moved to his family estate in Connecticut after they were married, which apparently was comprised of a set of houses that my great-grandmother would occasionally have moved closer or further to the main house by giant teams of workers and horses when one of her sons pleased or displeased her. When the family lost their money in the Great Wall Street crash of 1929, Jane couldn't cope with the idea of being poor again and killed herself, leaving her 3 young sons to be raised by a man who had no real-world work experience. After the partying lifestyle of the Roaring Twenties, the only work he was qualified for was as a sommelier and wine expert for a Fifth Avenue wine store. There is also Scottish Mary Williamson McKee, who married Navy Colonel Emery Swede Larson. I know that he fought in World War II and was the U.S. Naval Academy football coach for an undefeated decade, but I don't know anything about her except that she died when my grandmother was too young to remember her. I've already told you about Louise Baldwin, through whom I am related to yet another famous man, actor Alec Baldwin. But I've saved the great-grandmother who I feel closest to, although I have never met her, for last. I am named for Corina Esperanza from Santiago, Chile. I didn't know the full sadness of her story until I was almost 20. She married a German who had been, at 18, involved in blowing up a munitions plant in New York during World War I. To convince her parents that his impoverished German family had money, he convinced his youngest brother to spend everything on a fine suit and come to Santiago and regale her family with tales of their wealth. They emigrated to America, where, during World War II, the family was haunted by his past. After his older brother sold the story to Reader's Digest, which was at the time the equivalent of People's Magazines, Rocks were thrown through their windows, and their children were beaten up at school and accused of being Nazis. They moved from town to town, waiting until they were exposed and moving again. My grandfather was sent to military school, where he was regularly beaten and at one point forced to push a peanut across a room with his nose for chewing gum. Apparently, all the accusations of being a Nazi sunk in, because by the time I was born, he was an aggressive, sexist, racist alcoholic. He was shocked to find out, a few years before he died, that Karina's family had partly been Jewish, fleeing persecution in Spain. I was horrified to learn a few years ago that my great-grandfather had forbidden Karina from taking English lessons when they moved to the States in an attempt to keep her entirely dependent on him. My two grandmothers met at boarding school at 13 and became best friends and roommates. Both joined the Foreign Affairs Office as secretaries. Betty Baldwin's fiancé, my grandfather, told her that if she accepted her commission overseas, he wouldn't wait for her. She turned it down, gave him 4 children, only to be abandoned at Christmas for a close friend. In a time when women were not supposed to work, she became a real estate agent and raised her children alone. Mary Larson, my other grandmother, went to England, where she saw the Queen's coronation, dined with Danny Kaye, and saw Richard Burton perform Hamlet at Elsinore Castle. She met my grandfather, and I have never in my life known two people to be more in love. Up until the year he died, they made yearly visits to California together, and she would call me and tell me about their long walks on the beach and their secret hand squeeze language. 2 squeezes. Love you. 3 squeezes. Love you more. 2 squeezes. How much? Big squeeze. This much. She traveled around the world, met with world leaders and dignitaries, and found in Swami Chidananda, known internationally as the St. Francis of India, a spiritual leader and friend who led her into a life of peace, meditation, yoga, and self-acceptance and tolerance. My father's mother is my mother's godmother. That's a tongue twister. My father, Ken, who was raised in China and Taiwan, only got to know my mom, Catherine, who grew up in Virginia Beach, when they were 18, both visiting my great-uncle in Vienna. Kathy's a singer and a musician who specializes in medieval music. She can read ancient French, Latin, Gaelic, Old English, and a few other languages. When I'm a mother, I will tell my children about these women and their stories. I don't want them to find out about the men first, and then fill in the blank spaces only when they are old enough to ask questions. This is from a poem by Mary Tallmountain, a First Nations woman from Alaska, called Where Banshee Wind Is. The great belly heaves, red-brown hands pull out the slippery child. The tending women stop keening and tend to hear its first small cry. Banshee wind hurtles closer to the street, bearing a smudge of ochre dust. Upon me it turns, with heavy steps trudges west. Silence strums my ears.